understand the mystery. First take a look at the history. The words we use will give us clues. So join us now in Church Chatter. Hi, everybody. Welcome to episode 19 of the Church Chatter podcast, where we unpack a different church word or phrase each week. I'm Sam. I have my doctorate in language and culture, and I study religious linguistics.
And I'm Dillon. I have a Master of Divinity, and I'm an ELCA Lutheran pastor.
So it's February, Black History Month. Whatever the president says, we still acknowledge it. Dillon's eyes just got big. We still acknowledge it. Black history is all wrapped up in enslavement and liberation. So we thought that a good word to start off this month is Sabbath, which is also all about enslavement and liberation. So we're going to talk about the word Sabbath on today's episode. So I want to start by saying one of my favorite things about Christianity is that we are the child of Judaism, and Jesus was a Jew. And Judaism has such beautiful depth to it in a way that Christianity just doesn't, because I know Christianity is nearly 2,000 years old, and that seems really old, but in the grand scheme, it's really not. But Judaism, there's depth, there's ritual, there's festivals, there's just all kinds of stuff. Judaism's relationship with time is something that I'm currently obsessed about. So much so that I'm writing a book about it. I'm obsessed with how Jewish people have experienced time throughout history. So today we're going to talk about Sabbath. And Sabbath has everything to do with our relationship to time, which is a very spiritual matter, I believe. Would you say so too?
I would agree.
So let's just start by talking about, we're going to start and end very practical. I want to start by talking about what Sabbath is to us. So for me, Sabbath, I am prone, if you know me well, you already know this, Dillon knows this. I have a personality, for whatever reason, that is very prone to getting on the hamster wheel and never getting off. Would you agree?
I would agree. I would agree. You're quite the hamster wheel woman.
I can be tied to the machine very easily.
I can too. I have major workaholic tendencies.
Yeah, it's hard not to, honestly, with the way our culture relates to time. So the Sabbath is very important to me. We're pretty flexible in our Sabbath, meaning sometimes it's a whole day. We try to do it at least once a week. Sometimes it's even just half a day. Maybe in the morning we get some work done, and then we decide at noon we're turning off our phones, no screens. We're going to leave our phones at home, and we're going to go somewhere. What else do we do? No phones is a big one. Obviously no TV, but we don't do much of that anyway. Honestly, for me, it's no phones. If I can just put my phone down and turn my phone off and not answer text messages or emails and no computer or anything, that about does it for me. That solves a lot of problems and enters me into this state of no labor.
We do usually cook a meal, which
food is a part of it.
But usually for I don't want to say most, but for the kind of historic understanding of the Jewish Sabbath, Food would be prepared the Friday because there would be no cooking on Saturday. So we cook on Saturday.
Yeah, and there's a lot of theologians have written really beautiful things about this, but if you go back to the biblical story and the Jewish story, again, if you have no idea what Sabbath is, hold on. We're just holding tight. We're going to explain it all. But there's that story of the manna on the ground. And that can be turned into food. And the night before the Sabbath, you just trust that there will be enough and you don't have to labor. There will be double for Sabbath do you want to say anything about that? There's this trusting that if you take one day off every week, there will be enough to sustain you for that day. Somehow there will be enough. It's this really like, Dillon and I talk about this a lot. I very much struggle with scarcity mindset as much as I hate it and deny it. I don't like to have a lot of stuff. I don't even like to have a lot of food in the fridge. I like bare minimum. I have scarcity mindset when it comes to time. I think there's never enough time. I need to like write every single book now because, oh my gosh, I'm 34. I could be halfway through my life. Oh my gosh, this is crazy. I need to go. And I'm really trying to let go of that. And the Sabbath helps me because inherent to the Sabbath is this trust that you can stop your work and there will be enough food for this day. You don't need to plant food, harvest food, cook food, make food. You don't need to prepare food. There will be enough for this day.
So, I think that's well put together.
Yeah.
I not that I don't share.
You don't have that as much. You're a little more relaxed.
Yeah, like when I go to this is kind of a funny thing. When Samantha goes to the grocery store, she only gets
what is on the list.
What is on the list? What
of
we need.
Ingredients that are tied to a specific planned meal for the week.
Now I watch. We have a budget, so I watch the budget.
You're not frivolous by any means.
I'm not frivolous by any means. I'm trying to be pretty frugal, and yet I come home and it looks like a harvest festival.
Yes.
And
I like it to some degree. Okay, so let's ground all of this. So you might be wondering, why are you talking about scarcity mindset and food and going to the grocery store? All of this is wrapped up in the Sabbath. So let's situate it. The biblical story begins, so just so everybody knows, it's widely agreed upon by scholars who study this stuff that Genesis was actually written after the book of Exodus. The book of Exodus was written first. I wish that the book of Exodus came first. I can understand why people who put the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, together put Genesis first, but Exodus was actually written first. So the biblical story begins with the Israelites as enslaved people in Egypt. Long story short, Moses liberates them, and now they're wandering in this desert, right? We all hear about the wandering Jews, right? The Jews, the Israelites, they are wandering this desert for 40 years. Whether that's literal or metaphorical, we'll do a whole episode on that. But they are wandering this desert. So let's just really drop ourselves into this scene. Imagine thousands of people who had just spent their entire lives enslaved to the Pharaoh in Egypt, working. Their parents were enslaved people. Their grandparents were enslaved people. They don't know a life without enslavement, and suddenly they are liberated. Thousands of them wandering the desert. So to begin to understand the Sabbath, we need to first talk about the word freedom. Freedom without structure. I've said this on multiple episodes. Freedom without structure is not freedom, it's chaos. So when we go around and we hear Americans talking about freedom, freedom does not mean doing whatever we want. Freedom needs structure, and that's where society and policies and politics come in, because it's this communal effort to give our freedom structure. And when that structure becomes too rigid, that is indeed a problem. That's whenever we see government gone wrong. But we need this structure, right? So these Israelites, they're wandering the desert thousands of years ago. They were just freed. They're wandering. They're trying to get to the promised land, but it takes a long time, right? And Moses goes up on this mountaintop. He brings back the 10 Commandments. These 10 Commandments are an effort to bring structure. So you can only imagine.
They're also, let me.
Yeah, go ahead.
Let me make a note here. The Hebrew texts in Exodus and other places such as Deuteronomy, where we see the Ten Commandments, or as we know them as the 10 Commandments. The Hebrew word for these is the 10 rules, or the 10 the 10 like principles. The word commandment is not there. There's no commandment there. we have interpreted it to be commandments. We follow these 10 commandments that God
commanded,
or we're commanded to do them. But in the Hebrew text, that's not there. They are a philosophy of life. They are a kind of a rule of life. They're a principle of life. But principles and philosophies and rules are very different from that of command.
Yeah, I have read things about the 10 Commandments or the 10 rules that say, like, take notice that when Moses came back down, there was no punishment for what happens if you break these rules. Like, just notice that. That's important. And it might seem like, oh, well, that's obvious. No, that's important. Moses came down with this divinely given set of guidelines that people need to follow, but nowhere on there did it say, like, this is what will happen if you do this.
And some people have found passages to try to say, if you break these rules, interpret them in ways.
But here's what's really interesting. Whenever you keep reading the list of the commandments, eventually it says, what is it, like, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor. Coveting I could covet my whole life. Can you explain what covet means for us?
Well, covet is an interesting word in that you are wishing or wanting to have something that does not belong to you.
It's jealousy.
So, it can be jealousy, but it's more. It's when you covet your neighbor's property, or you covet your neighbor's spouse. It says wife, but let's be honest, it goes both ways. Mm-hmm. And so when you covet that, it's something that covet means to cove, to kind of capture and take. And so you see that your neighbor has I'm being slightly lewd here, but your neighbor has a wife or a husband or whatever the case may be, who's very attractive, and you would
want it
you
for
would
yourself.
like that person for yourself. That's a way of coveting. Or let's say your neighbor gets a new car. Mm-hmm. And you want, so it's wanting something that is not yours.
But even more than that, it's wanting your neighbor to not have it. Again, it's kind of this scarcity mindset of, well, if they have it, that means I'm losing something. But newsflash, life is not a zero-sum game. Just because somebody else has something nice doesn't mean that means we inherently have less. But what's interesting about this commandment about coveting is this is an internal desire. Well, coveting cannot be seen explicitly. So some of these commandments are, I could covet my whole life and nobody would know except me. And we're being told by God, presumably if you're a person of faith, we are being told by the divine force of the world, do not covet. Please don't do that.
And these, if you look at the 10 Commandments, if the 10 Commandments were somewhat followed fairly well, you could indeed have a rather just society.
Yes.
So I think of so depending on the Christian tradition that you come from, or even the Jewish tradition, the 10 Commandments are always numbered a little differently. So in the Lutheran Church, as I'm a Lutheran pastor, we have them numbered like that of the Roman Catholic Church because that's our inheritance. And so if you were to look at like the 9th commandment or the 10th commandment, 9th commandment is talking about not coveting your neighbor's house, right? So the idea is not just that you're coveting the neighbor's house because you like their house and you think it's a beautiful house and you want that house. If you take that house away from them, that then makes a person homeless. So it's not just about you coveting the neighbor's house because you think it's nice and beautiful and it has nice landscaping.
Yeah.
It's that you literally covet it and you want it, which would actually put a person out and make them homeless, to which God does not want.
Yes. But so I do want to make it clear that coveting isn't the action of taking something, it's the desire to do it, which is this
right. However, you can act on your coveting. You can
act on it, for sure, and as many people do if it lasts long enough, yeah.
And also the same thing real quick, too, is the whole idea of of the 10th commandment in particular focuses on livestock. So you're also, if you're coveting something in your heart, right? And let's say you don't act on it, that coveting is still inappropriate. But let's say you act on that coveting. Now, not only just like the ninth commandment, oh dear Lord, ninth commandment, you are you're wanting to take a person's shelter or their home, making them homeless. You're also wanting to take a person's livestock or their grocery, and now you're placing them in poverty. Now they're hungry.
Right.
So there's
well, it's also putting them in a vulnerable position to covet what other people have that they don't. And now once again, it's just keeping this thing in circulation. We could talk about the 10 Commandments for weeks on end.
Oh, I bet as a confirmation teacher, I love talking about the 10 Commandments. Okay.
So the reason we're talking about the 10 Commandments, so let's go back to the Israelites wandering the desert. They were just freed. For generations, they were enslaved people. They were enslaved to the Pharaoh. They were in Egypt. They were enslaved. They're freed by Moses. They're liberated. They're wandering the desert. Thousands of people, right? I don't actually know if it says how many. I only imagine thousands because I can't imagine there were only a couple hundred enslaved people in Egypt, right? It was many generations. They were continuing to have children.
Yeah, there's not a specific number.
Right, they had to have been thousands. So, thousands of people. So, I can only imagine... I've spent a lot of time really kind of dropping into this awareness of like, oh, wow, these people wandering the desert. I don't want to just pass over that. That's a big deal that situates a lot of what we're talking about in almost every episode. These people had to have been stealing and murdering and coveting in the desert because Moses wouldn't have to go up to a mountaintop to hear God and to really get in touch with the Spirit in order to write down these rules and regulations and to come back down and give it to them. You don't need to tell people who aren't murdering not to murder.
Correct.
I can only imagine the chaos that was taking place and I don't want to be anti-Semitic and I'm not saying these people were barbarous and uncivilized. That is not at all what I'm saying. I am saying that if any of us were enslaved, or even now, if you take thousands of people, we live in Pennsylvania, let's just take thousands of Pennsylvanians and put them in the desert together. There's no structure. What are we doing? We're going to start fighting over the food or lack thereof. We're going to, there's no structure. There's no, right? They needed to create a society from scratch, essentially. But what's interesting is they're wandering the desert, so they can't build buildings. They can't build temples to worship. They can't build these things. So they have the 10 Commandments. They start to kind of create these rules. My favorite book of the Bible is the book of Leviticus, which is most people's least favorite. I love it. I teach sociology, so I really love it because Leviticus gives these rules, here's how we're going to set up our society. Here's how we're going to do it. Here's what you're going to do, what you're not going to do. Here's how you're going to worship. Here's how you're going to take sacrifices. Here's how, just all of these things, right?
It's not only a priestly book because the Levite priests had a lot of influence with this, but it's also
it's a lot about equity.
Yeah, and it's also a book of structure.
Yes. Yeah.
Giving form to that of a society.
Yeah, and if you can't tell by my excitement with this episode, I'm very interested in just society, social structure, how groups arrange themselves in known and unknown, direct and indirect ways. That's very interesting to me. So the Israelites are wandering the desert. And they need to structure themselves. So and again, they're wandering, right? They're on the move constantly, so they're not in one place. So they've got the 10 Commandments. The book of Leviticus gives some different rules about how they're arranging their day-to-day lives. And then there's a commandment that says you need to observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy. So that's why we're talking about the 10 Commandments. One of these commandments that Moses came down from Mount Sinai and gave this tablet, right? Well, it broke a whole thing, right? But one of those...
Here's a question for you.
I probably don't know.
Professor. How many sets of 10 Commandments were there?
2.
What happened to the first?
It broke.
By who?
Moses.
Excellent. Okay. I won't ask any more questions.
Well, tell us what you want us to know, though.
Well, it's important to know that Moses, the way the story goes is that Moses had a call by God. He goes up to the mountain on Mount Sinai, and he has this.
Can I pause you really quick? Again, Moses just liberated these people, and he's looking around, and they are likely stealing from each other, coveting, sleeping with each other's partners, or I don't know if spouses is the right word yet, but right, there's all these things. They are killing each other, stealing from each other, like fighting about food or lack of food. And Moses probably needs a minute. He needs a minute in order to figure out, how, okay, I just liberated all these people, now what? So he goes to a mountaintop.
Yeah, Moses needs a minute. And also many of the ancient cultures and traditions, including ancient Israelites, who would become part of the Jewish faith, they believed that that God's presence was in that of the mountaintops.
Yep.
So the whole idea of looking to the mountains, I mean, if you read the Psalms,
even the Jesus story,
the idea that one is going to the mountains, not that God's not anywhere else, but specifically
so many mountaintops.
Well,
remember their understanding of the cosmos too. They thought the heavens were right up above the clouds, so to go to the mountaintops would make sense to get closer.
Right, so the story goes, Moses goes up to the mountaintop, has this experience with God, and God carves out of stone these two tablets, and then Moses comes down and sees that his fellow Israelites are living a life of absolute...
I'm so sorry, can I pause you one more time?
Of course.
I really like to ground all these stories. I also don't want to pass over, Moses carved this stuff into stone.
No, not the first time. That's not what it says.
Okay, what? Tell me what it says.
That God carved it with His finger.
Oh, interesting.
Now, whether or not you believe that, but that's the first.
Says.
That's the first tablet.
So
that God carved them out of stone, two tablets with His finger, and He wrote with His finger the two tablets. That's what it.
That is not a literal belief of mine, but
that's not a literal belief of mine either.
But the second one he carved.
No, the second one he had Moses carve.
Well, that's what I just said. He carved.
Moses. I thought you were talking about. Oh.
But carving.
But he still wrote it with
all of this.
He still wrote it with his finger. That's what we're.
Okay.
See, so no, but I'm saying it's interesting because people just think, oh well, the Ten Commandments, they come from God and Moses brought them. Yeah, well, there's a little bit more of an intricacy to the story.
So what I was going to say, the way I picture it, and we can debate the biblicalness of this, but Moses likely carved this into stone.
Of course he did.
That's no small task.
No.
That's a lot of text.
Many scholars believe that he was up there a very long time.
In fact, actually, we have like the thou shalt not murder. Many of these commandments were actually just one or two words. They're very direct, short words.
Right.
Because if you're carving it into stone,
they weren't
good
sentences.
golly.
They
weren't sentences written like the King James Version.
Thou art, thou love.
They're Hebrew.
Yeah, Hebrew.
Right, so just very short, direct, I don't know, like no murder.
Right, on stone tablets.
Yes.
And they were...
Okay, so keep going.
So
he comes down, he has the two
tablets.
comes
down, he sees that this is the way the story tells us.
He sees idols.
He sees the golden calf. They're worshiping the golden calf, and what upsets him so much about the golden calf is that when they were enslaved in Egypt, the Egyptian people worshipped golden idols, not things that point to God, not like religious images that point to God, but they were literally worshiping that idol itself.
Yes, and Moses was trying to tell them, like, you are Israelites, you believe in the God of Israel, one God, and yes.
That's why the first commandment is, you shall have no other gods but me.
Right, because these people were worshiping the God of their enslavers, and Moses was essentially trying to say, like, what are you doing? You're Israelites. Well, like, you are monotheistic. You have one God. You worship the God of Israel, not the gods of your enslavers.
Correct.
But they couldn't quite break free from the norms of their enslavement culture.
Right, and there's a difference. I want to make a very clear difference here.
Okay.
Because this is where people get that you can't have... you can't have artwork, or you can't have statues, or you can't have icons. That's not what this is talking about.
No.
If you walk into many of the ancient Jewish synagogues and the temples, there is artwork. And there is statues. I mean, we know about them even from the Ark of the Covenant. How historic that is, we could play with that. But there were gold angels over the thing. So the idea that you can't have any specific artwork or statuary, statues or icons, which are painted art of different
pictures of Mary,
or pictures of Mary or the saints or Jesus, and so that's not what it's talking about. It's talking about taking images like that and worshiping those images itself. Those images, for most people, are helping build a pointing to that which is unknown and unseen. Not really unknown, but unseen. And so those are two totally different things. I don't want to get on a bunny trail about that, but I do want to make that very specific.
We could do a whole episode on idols. I'm going to write it down.
Oh, that's a good one.
That's a whole
So Moses, in his anger, we're told in the story, smashes those 10 commandments, those 2 stone tablets, and then has to go back up, and how the story goes about it, he then has to carve them out himself, it alludes to, and then God writes them again with God's finger. Now, I don't think that literally happened with God's finger.
Metaphorical.
I think that Moses went up both times,
connected with God,
had a very true and real experience with God, and God through the Spirit helped him write these 10 commandments or rules, to which led the Jewish people.
Yeah.
And now also the Christians.
Yeah. And listen, if you're like, oh, Moses went to a mountaintop and wrote down something God told him, show me somebody who isn't having a hard time, and if they just hiked to a mountaintop and spent a little time up there alone, they wouldn't have some kind of epiphany or some thought or some peace about and clarity about something that's happening in their lives. We do this now too. We go and escape to the wilderness because we need a minute, because our people are driving us crazy. So we go to the mountaintop, we find some peace, we find some clarity. That's what happened to him. I feel like a lot of these biblical stories are like, oh, Moses went to the mountaintop. Oh, the burning bush. Where it's like, yeah, but haven't we all gone to a mountaintop?
Absolutely.
Hiked up top and like, oh, yes, I get it now. We're like, oh, I found the peace and clarity to be able to deal with this issue now.
I'm going to say something very
unpopular. And some people call that God.
Right. I'm going to say something very... Not only do I try my best to follow the 10 commandments, all 10 of them, I also teach them as a pastor to specifically confirmation students. Sometimes I'll weave them through my own sermons. It's a great... The 10 Commandments are a wonderful and beautiful tradition which we have inherited from our Jewish ancestors. And
they impact our legal system.
They impact our legal system, and Christians are called to follow the 10 Commandments. And I do believe that the 10 Commandments are inspired by God, but here's the caveat. And I do believe that Moses was inspired by God to craft these for the people, and God was most definitely the central part of this. But I also believe that the Declaration on Human Rights after World War II, a list of human rights that people have and that make society better, whether or not those people would feel that is something that God was a part of, I would see that as God ordained. That too, and that's a quote secular document. So I feel like yes, the 10 Commandments are unique to the Jewish and Christian tradition. They are unique, and they do have a special prominence, but that doesn't mean that other things are not important.
Yeah. And so
does that make sense?
It does.
Does that make sense?
It does. We're going to switch into the Sabbath, but I want to throw a wrench in because I like to just drop things and then keep going. Hebrew scholars, Jewish scholars, especially people who study the Hebrew Bible, Jewish scholars who study the Hebrew Bible. Aaron was written into the text. Moses' brother was written much later. He likely was not real. Boom. Mic drop. If you're interested in that, you can explore it. So let's keep going. Do you want to combat that quick?
Oh, no. I
Many
think...
Jewish scholars said that Aaron, it's very clear in the manuscripts, he was added later.
Yeah, I think there's enough.
Why? I don't know.
Historical
yes.
evidence for that.
Perhaps not to give too much focus to Moses.
I'm not
sure.
I don't think it is. I don't think possibly inserting the Aaron character was a bad thing or a wrong thing. I don't think it takes away from it, but I am of the persuasion that individual, the manuscripts are pretty clear that
it seems within Jewish scholarship it's not really debated. It's like, oh yeah, Aaron was added later, and we can still incorporate him because he's in the stories that we've got, but historically, likely.
And here's my thing with that. That is a Jewish text, and so I trust the Jewish scholarship.
Yes, for sure. For sure.
I look
to the Hebrew people.
I look to the Jewish scholarship for that. It's a Jewish text.
Yes. Okay. So, Sabbath. You've got these people, thousands of people, newly liberated. They're wandering the desert. They can't build buildings. They can't build a temple. They're trying to reconnect with their I don't know if I want to call it Jewish yet. Were they called Jewish yet at this point in history?
They were
right.
not.
So you can't call them Jews yet because they weren't in Judea, but
they're
Israelites. They're trying to connect with the God of Israel again and kind of create. I don't know if I want to say it's the birthplace of Judaism, but it's kind of starting to take shape here. It's really starting to take shape in the desert during this time after they're freed from Egyptian enslavement. So we have to talk about time, and then we'll really get into Sabbath. So they didn't have clocks. They didn't have watches. They didn't have Google calendars. They didn't have planners. What they had to relate to time, they had the earth. They had the sun. They had the phases of the moon. They had the seasons. So for us, a new day begins at 12:01 a.m. and the day ends at midnight. That is not how it was for the Jewish people. The days did not begin and end at midnight. When the sun went down, the day ended and a new day immediately began. So a fun little fact is the Hebrew word for month is Yerach, which comes from the Hebrew word for moon, right? So month, moon. So again, you can see time is arranging around phases of the moon and the sun and the earth and the seasons and all these things. A festival, I think it's a festival, the Rosh Chodesh means head of the month, and this is a holiday in the Jewish calendar observed at the beginning of each month. Or in ancient times, it was to celebrate a new moon and make offerings, right? So anyway, a new day began at sunset. So Sabbath for the Jewish community is from Friday after the sun sets to Saturday at sunset, because during this time, that's whenever their new days started and ended, right? So it has a lot to do with orienting to time. We are so cut off from the cycles of creation anymore. Especially with the internet and computers, things never stop. So we're cut off from that. But the Jewish people still kind of live into this. They still do Friday night to Saturday night for the most part. I'm speaking generally. Judaism obviously is a really big umbrella, but this is how it was in the ancient times. So remember that the Israelites were wandering in the desert. They couldn't build buildings. So they couldn't build a sanctuary. Like we have churches, right? If you're a Christian, they couldn't build a temple. They couldn't build a sanctuary. They built a sanctuary in time. And this kind of sounds metaphysical, but it's actually pretty grounded and practical. Sabbath is a sanctuary in time. So they, every Friday night at sunset until Saturday at sunset, they celebrated the Shabbat, Sabbath. Yeah. So let's talk about the word Sabbath. It literally means to stop. The Greek word, it can be traced to the Hebrew word Shabbat, which is where we get our word Sabbath and sabbatical. All of this is to say that Shabbat, or the Sabbath, has everything to do with stopping our labors for a given amount of time. A lot of people connect it to rest, and rest is for sure part of it, but you're not just like laying in bed all day. It has more to do with stopping your labors, because if you are newly liberated people and you're still working 7 days a week, you're not really free. Liberation needs rest to be liberation. Liberation is not liberation if you're still working all the time. You might as well still be enslaved. So the Israelites in the desert were nomads, meaning they were nomadic. They were always on the move. They didn't have a temple or a space of worship or sanctuaries. So they built this sanctuary in time. This is called the Sabbath. And the Sabbath could not be taken or destroyed or conquered. If you know anything about Jewish history, the Babylonians destroyed their first temple, and then the Roman Empire destroyed their second temple in the year 70. So their temples were destroyed. Obviously, the Jewish people have a long history of their things being destroyed. But the Sabbath has stood the test of time because it exists in time, and it can't be taken, it can't be destroyed. And I think that's so beautiful. There's something so deeply beautiful about that. It can't be taken. Do you have anything to add?
No, just that the Shabbat, the service of light on a Friday evening after dusk, to welcome that of the Sabbath on Saturday. If you ever get a chance, go to a Shabbat service after dusk on a Friday at a Jewish synagogue.
It's beautiful.
It's very, very beautiful. The lighting of the candles, the chanting of the prayers, the singing of uplifting songs, the lighting of a candle, the lighting of a candle, and usually the drinking of wine and challah bread. Challah bread is a specific Jewish braided bread.
Which, interestingly, they offered to us when we went a couple times, knowing that we weren't Jewish.
Well, we were at a Reformed synagogue.
Yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah, so...
I want to say really quickly, too, there's something, just in my limited experience, I don't want to generalize because I'm sure I'm wrong at some level, but the Jewish people, everybody knows, have had a very difficult history, and it just at every turn, it's just difficult. And us Christians, when I go to Christian services, the music can be so serious. And the music is either very serious and kind of solemn, or if you go to like a praise band kind of thing, it just sounds like radio music to me. It doesn't move me much. But then you go to a Jewish Shabbat service on a Friday night, and their music, I mean, we went 3 or 4 or 5 times. We went quite a few times.
Quite a bit.
And every time.
Probably more than that.
Yeah, we went for a while there. But every time we went, the music is so fun and, like, uplifting. Like, and I don't know if that's all the time or just when we went.
Well, it is, yes.
Okay.
I'm gonna defend here both sides.
Okay.
So, yes, that is true. So the synagogue that we used to attend occasionally on Friday nights for their Shabbat service was a Reform synagogue, and the Reform tradition within Judaism is the more inclusive kind of a strand or tradition of Judaism, at least I shouldn't say at least in the United States. Reformed Judaism is throughout the world now, but their music is indeed uplifting, and their worship book, their liturgical book, it comes from the 60s, and a lot of those songs have been kind of the Yiddish tunes have been crafted around, so it is uplifting. But if you were to go to the synagogue on Yom Kippur or Rosh Hashanah or something like that, the tenor of the music is going to be one of a little different, perhaps especially on Yom Kippur, much more solemn, like that.
Okay.
So just like the tradition, the Christian faith, the Christian religion, you can see that, sometimes the hymns drag on, but they also change with the season.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, the point that I wanted to make, which is only my limited experience in the Christian churches I've gone to and in the Jewish Reformed synagogues that we've gone to, is there's a lightness that comes after suffering. And if you go to a lot of Shabbat services, you can kind of feel it. This, like, they're aware of their liberation, and the service was kind of like, it wasn't this like, oh, we were enslaved. It was like, it felt like a celebration when we were there. It was very like, I don't know if upbeat is the right word, but you know what I mean? It felt like they knew they were celebrating something. That's what it felt like.
I agree. I agree with you.
I even think of the people that I know in my own life, not Jews, just anybody. When there is deep suffering, when people make it through that deep suffering, there's a joy, this like deeper, more settled lightness to their existence. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, well,
people who go through the darkness come out lighter.
The Jewish faith, the Jewish community also has a high percentage of actors and comedians.
Yeah, I was going to say that too.
Because
a lot of rabbis have been comedians.
So the rabbi who was there at
where we were,
at the Reform Temple where we were,
was
a former comedian
in New York, I think.
In New York,
yeah.
And so.
Yeah, he was funny. That changes it. Yeah,
and that's not. I mean, that's not like something like just here and there. That's quite a high percentage.
Very interesting. Okay, so liberation is not liberation if you're still working all the time. So the reason we started out this episode talking about Black History Month is because I have this book in front of me. Obviously, especially in our country, in the United States, there's a very unique Black history here that has everything to do with enslavement and liberation. And there's a book I have right here that I'm going to recommend. It's called Rest is Resistance, a Manifesto by Tricia Hersey. And I think I'm saying her last name right. And she's the founder of the NAP ministry. And her whole she's a pastor, theologian, and her whole premise, I listen to her talk often. She's a Black woman, and she does a lot of like community work. And this organization, this NAP ministry that she does, is essentially, it's rooted in the practice of the Sabbath. And I mean, it's right in the title, Rest is Resistance. We think we have to save the world. And her whole thing is, especially in our cultural context, capitalism was founded and thrived on the backs of Africans that we brought to our country and enslaved. And in fact, the most resistance kind of work that you can do is rest and unchain yourself from the machine and say, I'm not going to work for that machine anymore. That's Sabbath in practice. Is this like, we used to be enslaved and I'm not doing that anymore. It just took on new form, right? So these Israelites in the desert wandering, they were still behaving like enslaved people. They were still working and fighting over resources, all these things, because there's not enough. And Moses was trying to communicate through the 10 Commandments and through this Sabbath thing that, hey, you're not enslaved people anymore. You're liberated. There's a new way to do things. We don't have to turn that way of enslavement and just like make it take new form. No, we can actually create a liberated way of living, and regularly practicing the Sabbath is part of that. So that book, Rest is Resistance by Tricia Hersey, is so good and has been transformative for me, just to kind of understand how rest, especially for certain demographics, can be so counterintuitively productive and resistive to the powers that be, which is very good. You might hear our dog walking around. So there's the NAP ministry. Let's talk more about Sabbath. Well, I want to talk about how the Jews, so we don't want to talk for all Jews again, but let's just talk some general things about the Jews and their Sabbath, and then we'll talk about what it can mean for us as non-Jews, if you're a non-Jew listening, which I think most of you are. So let's just be kind of orthodox about it for a minute. The Sabbath for the Jews, for the Israelites, for the Jews today, no electricity, no cooking, no preparing food. It all has to be done ahead of time. Obviously no screens because there's no electricity.
A lot of people will not drive.
Right, no driving. You gather. Food is a big part of it. You eat. Candlelight is often kind of a thing associated with it. You gather with people. It's a lot about connection.
There's prayer.
There's prayer, worship. You start with a Shabbat service at the synagogue, right? So you start with this kind of worship. And you can, studying and reading and learning is also permitted. That's a big part of it too. So you can study scripture, read, learn, engage in those conversations. So connection, learning, food, and really just stopping your labors is a huge part of it. Am I missing any huge parts there?
Well, there's supposed to be no money making.
There you go.
There should be there has been a historic understanding that on the Sabbath there is no labor connected to monetary gain.
That's really interesting in today's context, because I think of Dillon and I. So you're supposed to like study and read those days, or the Sabbath days. Not supposed to, but that's a thing you can do.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's the practice of the Sabbath. But today it's also intertwined. So at least for Dillon and I, reading and studying is actually tied to how we both make money. So is that money making, right? It's all very blurred today in our very late stage capitalistic society. It's all very blurred.
Well, there's always been a historic argument as to so these rules apply to the greater community, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, did those like this is not my pushback, but this has been a historic pushback to Sabbath practices. Well, in the ancient Israelite religion, again, which evolved into the Jewish religion, the Jewish faith, the priests were not taking a Sabbath on the Sabbath day, and now rabbis, they're working. Mm-hmm. If you carry it into the Christian tradition, priests and pastors, they're working, and they're getting paid for it. Yeah. Most of the time, if you're in the vocation of the professional clergy.
Yeah.
So the question is, the clerical class. I hate to say it in that framework, but the clerical class has always had a clash with that of the actual practices themselves.
Yes, but I imagine that after a Shabbat service, a rabbi could then observe the Sabbath.
Oh, absolutely. After worship on Sundays, I come home and I observe a rest and a Sabbath. On Saturdays, I try to, unless I have a funeral, usually in the morning, but then I come home and I observe Sabbath practices of my own.
Well, and a huge part of Sabbath is praying. And actually, let's talk about this. Let's really talk about this. You and I talked about this months ago. I don't know if you remember. Dillon's contract as a pastor, one of the bullet points on that list, it says the whole work an average number of hours, a certain number of hours each week. It'll average out because as a pastor, some weeks are way busier than others, and it all averages out. But one of his duties that he is contractually obligated to do is to pray for people. And yet, I'm willing to bet that a lot of people would not understand if Dillon said, I'm sorry, I go home on Sundays after church. I need to be home by noon because I'm going to spend 3 hours praying for people. They'd probably be upset by that. But that is an obligation of yours. Well, actually, on the contract, you are supposed to do that. You're supposed to uphold these things.
Not only on the contract, but my ordination vows as a pastor, as a minister of word and sacrament in the Lutheran Church, I am required. It is a part of my vow to God and the church that prayer. I will engage in regular prayer. So when I say that I'm praying for somebody, I'm not just. I literally. Some people might say, "Oh, but dear God, do you be praying all the time?" Well, that's the whole thing. When I tell someone that I will pray for them, or for them individually, or their family, or the group, I do.
Your job is to actually set aside time and do it.
Yes, I uphold that vow that I have taken. I take
and
that
prayer is part of the Sabbath.
Yes,
so
I
I
take that very seriously.
Right. Okay. So. What does Sabbath mean for us? Well, no. Let's get this out of the way. Let's talk about this. Some people, I don't know what it is. I'm just going to be really frank about it. I'm not sure what it is, but it comes up a lot. There's almost like this conservative conspiracy about like, Christians got it wrong. You're observing Sabbath on the Sunday. It's a problem. So I know that you know a lot about that, more than I do, because it's just not an interesting question to me.
You're talking about me?
Yeah, I know that you know a lot more about this, but it's not an interesting question to me because I see the value in having structure, but keeping that structure flexible, because rigidity, I've said this on many episodes, I've been in enough therapy to know that rigidity is the first sign of severe psychological unwellness, like lack of health. When you come across somebody who's super rigid about the rules, they're either very young, because that's very immature thinking, right? My daughter, who is 4, Tabitha, she's very rigid about the rules right now, which is fine. She's 4. But when you see a 40-year-old who is very rigid about the rules, that is a sign that, oh, this person isn't doing well. They're grasping onto this. And it doesn't mean like, oh, they're bad. No, it means let's hold this gently, because something's going on. They feel unsafe, so they are clinging to the rules, and they want everyone else to cling to the rules with them, right? It's a sign of unsafety and unwellness. So unwellness seems even to like a lack of compassion. I say this with compassion because I too, when I am unwell, cling to rigidity of like, this is the bedtime. I can do that too. I'm not exempt from it. So I say that because for me, the argument about what day is the Sabbath is full stop for me, because Jesus was healing people on the Sabbath. And when people called Jesus out because he wasn't observing Sabbath on the right day, and all these things, and like he was breaking Sabbath rules, he combated it. He was like, no, I'm going to heal people because the Sabbath day was made for people, not the other way around. So for me, it's not even an interesting debate, but can you talk a little bit about why people care and people seem to get... Well, I want to say one more thing. If you're listening and you're somebody who is really concerned that Christians seem to talk about Sabbath on the Sunday, which Dillon will talk about whether or not that's true in a minute, but if you're really concerned, I've heard a lot of people saying like, oh my gosh, us Christians, we celebrate Sabbath on the wrong day and it's sacrilegious and it's wrong and there's like some conspiracy about it, I don't know. Well, then you can celebrate the Sabbath on the day you think you're supposed to. But I have yet to see any of those people who apparently have such strong opinions about what day the Sabbath should be observed actually observe it on the day they believe it should be observed, because you can do that on your own. You can do that. You could probably even find a community to do it with you. And yet people like to attack institutions, but then not actually attack that same problem within them. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So go ahead and explain Sabbath and Sunday and the day of it and what the whole argument is, because I don't know.
All right, so the first thing is that Jesus of Nazareth was a practicing Jew, and we do know that the story that the scriptures tell us, that Jesus on multiple occasions, most likely weekly, would have attended the synagogue on the Sabbath day, which would have been Friday into Saturday. Mm-hmm. So we do know that Jesus, being a practicing Jew, would have attended synagogue, specifically on Saturday for services, perhaps the dusk, the service of light on the Friday night, although that has been a somewhat of an evolving tradition within Judaism. And so we do know that, and yet we also, just like Samantha said, we know, at least we're told in the scriptures, and there's some other things too outside of the canonical scriptures that talk about Jesus doing practices that were seen as not permitted to be done on the Sabbath. And so Jesus, according to the Jewish authorities, the Jewish religious authorities, was a breaker of the Sabbath. So he was breaking, depending on how you number the Ten Commandments. The Sabbath day in the Lutheran tradition, the Sabbath day is the third commandment, and so he was breaking the third commandment according to the religious authorities of the time. So Jesus was a Sabbath breaker. And yet, at the same time, he was a Sabbath keeper, in that he attended and took took the day of rest and went to the synagogue and
but again,
ate with his family.
You're seeing Jesus lift up this flexibility.
Yes.
And whenever the religious, righteous people or self-righteous people are calling him out, it's him essentially saying, like, you don't need to be so rigid. These rules are to help you, not so you can walk around being rigid and judging everybody else for not following the rules. They're here to help you.
Jesus' whole ministry was a ministry of both and, not either or.
Yes, of flexibility.
He was constantly saying, yes, you need guidelines and principles, or if you want to call them rules. Yes, you need that. Actually, there's a passage that speaks. I have not come to abandon the law, but to fulfill it. So Jesus didn't come to abandon and take away rules and principles and guidelines. He came to fulfill it and even it out and balance it out in a way that you're not in fear of these rules, but they're called to liberate you. And when and if there is someone in need on a specific day, i.e. the Sabbath, that you are called to care for that person and not just sit and rest and then wait till the next day. And so Jesus is both. If you take away anything from this podcast, take away a lot of things. But Jesus was both a Sabbath keeper and a Sabbath breaker. Mm-hmm. Okay, so there's that, and then many people, and this is a common question. Many people will ask, well, when do I have to observe the Sabbath, and does it have to be on a specific day? Well, the Jewish religion states that it's on a specific day, and for those who are born or converted to Judaism, they celebrate the Sabbath beginning at dusk on Friday and the whole day Saturday. That is the Jewish tradition. So if you
because they do it as a community.
They do it as a community.
Yeah.
And so if you are a person of the Jewish faith or converted to the Jewish faith, that is the practice of the Jewish faith. Now, Christianity is a different religion.
Well, and I want to also just make sure everyone knows that Jews, just like Christians, there's a lot of different expressions of Judaism.
Absolutely.
Sabbath is going to look different for a lot of different kind of Jews as well. There's Orthodox, there's Reform. I mean, every synagogue might do it a little differently. Yes, so it's not like there's one perfect way.
Not to use a big word, but Judaism, like all religions, is not monolithic.
Meaning there's not one expression.
Meaning there's not one expression. There is one religion, Judaism, and it is interpreted and expressed in a multitude of different
countless ways. Yeah.
So we have to keep that in mind. Just like Christianity. So I'm going to move to Christianity now.
Yeah.
And so Christians have their specific religious observance on a Sunday. Right? Mm-hmm. Now, some people have written and said that Sunday now replaces the Saturday Sabbath. That is not true. That is not true. The Sunday observance for Christians is something totally different. It's not called the Sabbath, even though some people colloquially call that the Sabbath. That is not taking the place of the Jewish Sabbath. Mm-hmm. The Sunday and the observance of Sunday is something called the Lord's Day. And the Lord's Day is a time to which people gather in one place. Worship. They pray together. They sing songs together. They hear the scriptures. They have a meal, communion. And they are sent out to make the world a better place. So it's gathering, it's the word, it's a meal, and it's ascending. There's a fourfold thing, with some things like singing in there as well.
Well, and Jesus is said to be the new Sabbath for Christians, so that's why Christians don't have this kind of formalized Sabbath.
Correct.
Not to say there's not value in it, and it shouldn't be experienced, but...
So, interestingly enough, the observance of the Sunday, the Lord's Day, for Christians, is something different from that of the Jewish Sabbath. It is not the same thing. It never has been the same thing. Christians celebrate Sunday because it is the Lord's Day and the day of resurrection. That's why we meet in the morning, because of the tradition of Jesus on Easter morning, on Easter day, the women that went to the tomb, it was at dawn or early in the morning. And so that's why we meet in the morning. It's also why we share the meal, just like as they went on the road to Emmaus, the risen Jesus, they met the risen Jesus in the eating of bread and wine. And so that's why we have the meal on Sunday, right? So there's all these things. Mm-hmm. And so the interesting part is, this is very specific to the Lutheran Church, and this is why I'm sharing this with you. I know that not everyone that listens to this podcast is Lutheran, but the third commandment in the Small Catechism, and the Small Catechisms are an official way that churches teach and understand the Scriptures in specific denominations. So
Jews have this too, like a commentary.
Jews have commentaries on
the Torah,
mm-hmm. Such as the Talmud and others. And so catechisms mm-hmm. are the interpretations and teachings of the Scriptures of a specific church. Okay, mm-hmm. So from the Small Catechism of the Lutheran Church and the third commandment, it says, the third commandment is remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. And then it asks this question in the catechism, what does this mean? Or what is this? And it says, we are to respect and love God so that we do not despise preaching or God's word, but instead keep the word holy and gladly hear and learn it. That is not on a specific day. That is living the Sabbath every day. Yes. It's making the Sabbath a part of your life as hearing God's word, living God's word, taking a time of rest when you need it, taking a time from your labors, and when and if needed, to help those in need, just like Jesus did. And so the Sabbath for the Christian is required to be kept, but the specific day of it, it could vary. Now, here's my offer. If you're a person who is so, I don't want to say caught up, but so caught up or so preoccupied with the specific day, and you are not a Jew or a convert to Judaism, and let's say you're of the Christian persuasion, then there is a church for you. It's called the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And the Seventh-day Adventist Church is a Christian denomination that does not meet on Sundays. They meet on Saturdays.
They're called the Seventh-day Adventists because they're very concerned about the next coming of Jesus, which is the Advent, right? And the seventh day is because of the Sabbath, the seventh day, which they believe is Saturday.
And they keep the Jewish Sabbath, and they do not celebrate the Lord's Day. They do not celebrate.
They have very strict dietary rules.
But if you're interested in observing the Sabbath on a Saturday and
with a Christian
community, then I would encourage you to seek out the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which is its own denomination, a very beautiful denomination. I can say, I have to be very blunt here, it would not be a denomination I would want to be a part of, but it's a very lovely tradition, and so you could find yourself in a Christian community that observes the Jewish Sabbath on a Saturday and still has the teachings of Jesus, with a focus on the second coming of Jesus. There's a lot of things going on there.
I want to tell you a funny story about Seventh-day Adventists. So I had this student who will remain nameless, like 5 or 6 years ago, and on this college campus, he was in my class, and I can't remember. There's something about the diet of that church. Well, there's certain foods they can't eat.
They promote vegetarianism.
Okay, so there's this student who would always have like chicken fingers and cheeseburgers. He'd come into my class eating, because I don't care if students eat in my class, as long as they're not making a mess or whatever. So he was eating, and there was going to be a festival on campus. And I was going to be at the festival, and this student was going to be at the festival. And he came up to me after class. I don't even know if I've told you this or not.
I think you have, but I forget.
So he came up to me and he said, I have to go home every weekend because my mom makes me go to church still. And I said, oh, okay. And he said, so my mom is coming this weekend, and she's really nice. She's going to want to meet all my professors if they're here. And I said, okay. And he goes, make sure you don't tell her what I eat in your class. And I said, why? And he said, because I'm not allowed to. I said, what do you mean you're not allowed to? And he said, oh, we don't eat that stuff at my church. I'm not allowed to eat that stuff. We think our body is a temple. We take it very seriously. Like, that's the language that he used. And he was like terrified that I was going to tell his mother
that he ate chicken fingers,
as if that was going to come up casually in conversation. But yes, he did not want his mother to know that he was eating this food because his Seventh Day Adventist? Am I saying that right? Church. He was just afraid that they would find out, which I thought that was really funny.
Yeah,
not funny. It was very serious to him.
Right. And I again, it's a very beautiful tradition, and it works for many people. Yes. So this is what I would say. I would say that the argument stops with whether or not like should all Christian denominations switch to Saturday instead of Sunday. It's for since the very beginning there were some groups that were still in the early Jesus movement. There were some Jewish followers of Jesus who accepted Jesus as the Messiah, the Anointed One, yes, that were still attending synagogue on Saturdays, but also meeting on Sundays for this new Lord's Day.
Yeah.
However, as time went on, less people that were following Jesus were going to synagogue on Saturday, and they were observing the Lord's Day. So the Lord's Day is the longest history and tradition of Christian worship.
Yeah.
And here's the other thing. So if someone says, once again, well, it should be on Saturday, then I would once again clearly state, and I know I sound almost mean about this, but then go to the Seventh-day Adventist church.
Right.
Or another Christian group, probably that's smaller, that would observe something on
and would interpret it
on the Saturday. There's groups out there like that. The last thing I'd say is this. In the early days of the Jesus movement, having to do with the observance of Sabbath, okay, this is very important. There were, once again, Jewish followers of Jesus
that's exactly what I was about to say.
Well, then I don't want to steal it from you.
Go ahead.
There were Jewish followers of Jesus, once again, who accepted him as the Messiah and the Anointed One, and still practiced Judaism, the Jewish religion. And then there were other Gentile Christians or Greek Christians that knew nothing about the Jewish religion and knew nothing about the Jewish traditions. And they accepted Jesus as their leader, as one whom they would eventually...
Well, let's even go back a little further.
Hold on. Worship, but they had no connection
to Judaism.
Well, they had no connection to the Jewish observance of Sabbath from dusk on Friday to the day of Saturday.
Yeah, so let's take it back even a little further. So Jesus died, and there were these Jesus communities popping up. There was no unified Christianity for a couple hundred years after Jesus' death, when Constantine came onto the scene in the 4th century, yada, yada, yada. So these Jesus communities were popping up, and then Paul was spreading this to Gentiles, meaning non-Jewish people. Paul was trying to get non-Jewish people on board with this God of Israel. I have a little bit of a cold, so I'm coughing. But Paul was trying to get people, among other people, spreading the story of Jesus, trying to get these Greeks on board, these Gentiles, these non-Jewish people. But it got tricky for a while because these non-Jewish people were coming to worship the God of Israel, the same God, but they weren't quite Jewish. One huge reason for that is because Judaism, to be a Jewish man especially... Hold on, I'm going to take a sip of water. To be a Jewish man, you had to get circumcised. These non-Jewish men especially were like, I have to do what? And that's a painful procedure. And they flat out said no. So then Paul started to say, no, you don't have to be circumcised. Because if that's keeping people from living into the Jesus story and keeping the Jesus story alive, that can't be a barrier. So you start to see this split almost between Messianic Jews and like Jesus following Jews, and then not quite Christians yet, but like Gentile worshipers of the God of Israel and Jesus followers. You see this split, and then eventually This part's a little hazy, but at some point in history, then there had to be this split. Now there's Christianity, and we need to separate ourselves from Judaism. For better or worse, I'm not saying that was the best choice or the worst choice, I'm not sure, but it is the choice that took place. So they started doing things differently. Oh, they worship on their Sabbath. We have to worship at a different time because we don't want to be Jews. We're something else now because we don't do circumcision. We're not observing all of these festivals, right? Like things shifted. Days of fasting changed, right? So Christians fasted on different days.
Well, and
baptism took the place of circumcision, which is why baby baptism, one of the reasons baby baptism became a big thing, because baby circumcision was a thing. Women were baptized because, again, in Judaism, men wear head coverings. In early Christianity, women wore head coverings, right? There were a lot of things that got flipped on its head because they were trying to separate themselves, for better or worse, from Judaism. Does that make sense? Did I explain that in a way that makes... That's one factor. It's not the whole story, but that's one factor is, okay, we need to have a different day because if we keep worshiping on the same day as them, there's still this blurred line of like, what's Judaism, what's Christianity? It got messy.
Right, and you also have something going on here. This is getting a little beyond Sabbath, but it still connects. Connects to the Sabbath ethos, the Sabbath way of living in the world, and even the Sabbath day itself specifically. But so Judaism, for a very, very long time, so many would argue from the very existence of the Israelite people, and then the evolution into how we understand Judaism today, is that Judaism had always been a religion of inheritance. So yes. You were born. There wasn't.
Judaism's not about choice.
No, there wasn't about it.
There
wasn't a plethora of people converting to Judaism. Judaism was a birthright religion to which you were born into, and then you followed until your death. So
there was no easy method of conversion.
No.
So it got complicated.
And when I mean the early Jesus movement, I'm talking about beginning with Jesus' life and at least the first century. Okay. After he died. So you have in the very early Jesus movement, you have kind of this reformed understanding of the Jewish faith and following the teachings of Jesus. And most people who were joining this were people who were older. And as time went on, these people who were middle-aged or older who were following Jesus, they also had children and families. And what did that mean? There started to be questions of what did that mean for the children of these people? And so you get into the 2nd and 3rd century, and you start to see what? You start to see the Jesus movement that would evolve and morph into Christianity. You start to see it as not now a movement of individualism, of people joining a community as individuals, but a faith of inheritance, a faith of the covenant, a faith of community. So now you are no longer having children born of parents that aren't Christians. You're having children born of parents who are Christians, who are a part of
a person
household.
Doesn't get baptized, a household gets baptized. That means the mother, the father, if grandparents and in-laws are living with you, enslaved members of the household. And we can argue about whether or not that was good or bad, because enslaved people didn't have a choice. But back then, choice wasn't
like it is today.
It wasn't like, oh, I believe. It's like, no, this is something that our whole household is doing together. Oftentimes, multiple households at once, like communities of people doing it together.
And also
you wouldn't have seen just a mother go and decide, I believe in Jesus, I'm going to go get baptized, I'm part of this thing now. No, it was a household. It was
right.
a community.
In the very early days, that could have been the case, and yet we do know that. I mean, even when Jesus is baptized in the River Jordan, which most historians believe was an actual historical event with a historical Jesus, and he was baptized in the Jordan River, most likely by John. But these were groups of people were going to get baptized, right?
Didn't do it alone.
They didn't do it alone.
No.
Just like when I baptized, so in the Lutheran tradition, the tradition is that it's mostly infants and young children who are baptized, and they're baptized with a group of people, in the midst of the group of people. It's not just...
Who are committed to keeping these kids...
Right.
In the fold of living in this Jesus ethic.
Right, and Paul is very interesting in that, and this could be problematic here. This could be problematic, and yet it also has a parallel. Paul's parallel between Jewish circumcision and Christian baptism is something very interesting, because Jewish circumcision was not happening when someone was old and making a decision. It was happening with an infant child who was being brought into a community, a covenant, a religion, a faith, to be brought up hopefully until that person dies. When we talk about baptism, especially in Christianity today, we see this: the child is blessed and welcomed and baptized as an infant, and that child grows up in the faith, arguably, hopefully, until death. Now, that doesn't always happen, but just like the Jewish faith.
The Jewish people also have this very direct connection with ancestors and lineage, too.
Right, and so...
we don't really treat Christianity that way, which is interesting.
This idea of religion of inheritance and religion of choice, that evolved to be, and the idea of Sabbath in all of that is that Sabbath, at least in the Christian understanding of things, Sabbath is a principle, is a tenet of the Christian faith that is to be upheld and practiced,
yes,
but as an ethos and a way of living, not just on the specific day.
Right, and if you're wondering why are we talking about choice and baptism and circumcision, it's related to Sabbath because the Jewish people, they didn't feel like they had to choose the God of Israel. They were born into it. There was no choosing. So for them, they cared more about orthopraxy, which is a fancy theological way to say doing the right things. So observing the Sabbath, observing certain festivals, right? Worshiping. They were very concerned with how they oriented themselves to time, observing festivals throughout the year, observing the Sabbath once a week, arranging their days in a certain way, praying at certain times, all of these things. The way they scheduled their lives, orthopraxis, so how they practiced the faith, that's what Jews cared about, even overwhelmingly today. That's what they care about. Christianity evolved to care about, oh my gosh, the word's escaping me.
Orthodoxy.
Thank you. It's such a common word, but orthodoxy, which is about the right beliefs, which has not been the truth for the entirety of Christian history or religious history, but especially because of individualism and capitalism, and I'll even say democracy, which I love democracy, but just this kind of individual, every vote, all this stuff, right? We care about individuals. That has really impacted it, among other things, throughout history. So we think that believing the right thing, and Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, right? Religion thinks that, especially Christianity, we think that we're so like, oh no, we're not influenced by scientific revolution. No, we treat the Bible as if we're reading it through a scientific lens, when that was never how religion was meant to be viewed. But people do it all the time. Atheists, Christians, devout Christians, we do it all the time. But anyway, Jews cared about practicing faith the right way. Christians today tend to think we need to believe the right thing. But for Jews, practicing the Sabbath was part of this orthopraxy. So that's why we're talking about this. Because, okay, I want to pause there. I feel like up until now we've been talking so much about doctrine and doing it the right way, which is actually something I care very little about. I want to ground...
that, hold on,
okay,
yes, but
okay.
let me, and I know
We'll move into the conclusion.
We're at good time here, but so one thing, so there's two issues here.
Okay.
Because orthopraxy,
which is about right
practice or right action, is a wonderful and beautiful thing, unless you are connecting orthopraxy with that of salvation, of experiencing God in the here and the hereafter, and that's how it gets you there. Because no one is going to be able to live up because of brokenness in our own self and the world. Hold on. No one is going to be able to live into that. And that is the idea that you have to do something can be problematic.
But that's why Jesus was saying
to
the religious elite. That's why Jesus was saying the Sabbath was made for man, not the other way around. Like, it was made for people, because the Sabbath is a sanctuary and time where you can connect with God. It's not about, like, we have to do it because it's the rule and we're going to get in trouble otherwise.
Right,
no.
Or we're not going to experience eternal life or wholeness. And then the other side of it, with the orthodoxy, which is right belief, is also both good and problematic.
It's all in the head.
The good part of it is that you're trusting that God's promises are true. You're trusting that. It's more centered on God than it is on you having to do something. You're trusting that God's promises are true, and you experience wholeness and eternal life and salvation and all these things. Right. One of the issues is that if you're just trusting that and you're just doing that, you could say, oh, well, I already got it and I don't have to do anything in the world.
Yes.
So they have both, you know, there's good,
like everything, it's about your posture towards it.
I'm sorry, I went off on that little tangent.
I like tangents. I live for tangents.
Mm-hmm.
So, like I said, I want to ground it at the end, because we've been talking for over an hour about, like, doctrine and the do's and the don'ts and why we have it and the history of it, which I find fascinating. But you can get personal if you want. Dillon doesn't usually like to get too personal. I have no problem getting personal. So I want to ground Sabbath and talk about why I need Sabbath in some way in my life. And I'm doing this because maybe you'll connect with it, or maybe at the very least you'll think I'm a crazy person, and I can live with that. I won't lose sleep at night because of that. But we live in a time where we think we need to save the world, and this is actually keeping us enslaved. I know a lot of people, I'm going to be super, super honest right now. I know a lot of people with recent political things going on, and with Trump winning the presidency, there are a lot of well-meaning Democrats who are like, we need to do something, and I'm angry, and we got to fix it, and we got to do all these things, and they're tired, and they're grumpy, and they're not actually fixing anything, because they're taking this. And listen, there's a place for anger. I'm not saying you shouldn't be angry. I'm not saying we should live into, like, toxic positivity. But I am saying, and it was true whenever Biden was elected too, right? You have, like, in our political system, there's just people who think they need to save the world and think that they have the idea. They think that they have the thing that will bring wholeness to everyone. They have the answers. The Sabbath, if you can really live into it, is about one day a week stopping your labors and realizing life goes on without your labor. Life goes on when you're not manipulating, working, controlling, and trying to fix everything. So if we don't rest and take time to just sit around a table and eat good food by candlelight with people that we love, then are we even free? Are we even liberated? I'm not saying that we should stop trying to save people and look out for the marginalized. That's not what I'm saying at all, so don't misunderstand me. But I am saying that if we aren't experiencing the freedom that we do have, then what are we even fighting to preserve? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I refuse. For me, Sabbath is an act of resistance. And sometimes we need more than a day. Sometimes we need a couple weeks. We need to, like, lean into winter a little bit and just relax and take a step back, because our constant need to control and fix and tell people when they're wrong is actually making things worse. I'll even say this: if you are a Democrat and you are angry about Trump's stuff, perhaps our actions and our moral righteousness, and listen, me too, but perhaps that made things worse, and it's an equal and opposite reaction to us telling people for years that we are better and we have the answer. Think about people in your life when they tell you, this is what you need to do, this is the answer. Think about how defensive you get and how you feel like you need to prove your point. That's what's happening at a national scale right now. So maybe the practice of the Sabbath can help us contain and learn that actually we don't need to save the world every day, because we're actually making it worse. And again, that's not me saying you need to be complacent. It's not me saying that you can have righteous anger. You need to be angry when things are wrong. It's okay to call certain things out, but maybe we can do it with a little more compassion and love. Me included, Dillon included. I got a little vulnerable there, but I have more to say. So Sabbath can be seen as a form of resistance. It's when I practice the Sabbath, it's me saying I refuse to stay tied to the machine, because here's the thing for me. Hopefully you can connect to this. I think a lot of people can. I played that game. I played the capitalism American dream game. And Dillon knows this because we've been married for 6 years. Dillon has watched me for over 7 years now battle. I'm gonna use this language. I don't usually like this language, but battle this demon within me. I played the game. I climbed every single ladder that people put in front of me. I got good grades in school. I played sports. I was president of the math club. I went to college. I was in a million clubs at college. I was the president of this club and the supervisor of this club. I did all of the things.
Captain of the swimming team.
Captain of the swim team. I had 3 jobs while I was in college full time. I didn't need those 3 jobs, y'all. I could have been fine with 1. But I had 3 jobs. I worked more than 40 hours a week. I was a full-time student. I went to graduate school while I was working full-time and had a part-time job. I said yes to every single thing. And you know what happened right before I met Dillon? When he met me, this is the stage of life I was in. I cared about everything. I cared loudly. I cared aggressively. And not just from a keyboard. There were poor people in the community that I was living in, so I volunteered to do their taxes for free about 15 hours a week during tax season. There were people who dropped out of high school who wanted to get their GED, so I volunteered to teach 10 to 20 hours a week so people could get their GED. This was unpaid labor, right? And I actually loved that, and I don't regret it, but there were nonprofits who needed people to serve on their boards and their committees, so I did all of it. Do you remember whenever you met me? I was on 4 boards of directors, 7 committees, volunteered teaching, just finished grad school, had a full-time job and a part-time job at an ice cream shop. It was crazy. Do you remember that? It was insanity. And I thought I was helping people. And at some level, on the surface, I was. All of that is to say, and I do want to be clear, I really love tutoring the GED students. I really love that. But it all quickly and slowly collapsed in on me. I was operating, so I want to be really clear about this because I think this is the part a lot of people can connect with, or maybe I'm just totally alone in this, maybe. But I wasn't actually doing it. I was fed from it. I was helping people, but I was actually operating from this kind of grandiose sense of self. I thought that I was being kind and selfless, but I wasn't actually being kind and selfless. I was doing it because I wanted to feel kind and selfless. Do you understand that difference?
Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm. It was me feeding my own ego because I wanted to feel like I'm not one of the bad guys. I'm out there helping people. I'm doing the work. And I wasn't, yes, I wanted to help people, but even more than that, if I'm being really honest with myself, I wanted to put things on my resume. I wanted to look good, and I wanted to convince myself that I wasn't bad. I was doing it for my own ego. It collapsed in on me about 5 or 6 years ago, and then COVID happened and I became a mother, and it really just all came to a sudden end. And I stripped my life down to the bare minimum, and we make Sabbath a priority. Sometimes we do, some weeks are better than others, but it brought this kind of clarity and connection and calmness to my life that I needed desperately for almost my whole life, since middle school, when I kind of for whatever reason, brought on this overachieving kind of persona onto me. And saying, I don't know, I think we're all told this story about saying yes to everything. And Sabbath is this posture towards all of life about sometimes it's all right to say no. It's okay to carve out time and keep it holy. In fact, it's one of the commandments. And we all know those people, and maybe you are. I used to be. I can be guilty of it still. But whenever we're like, oh, I'm just so busy. I almost have no tolerance. Whenever I catch myself saying that, I almost have no tolerance, because so many of the people who are saying, oh, I'm just so busy, and they like list all the things they're doing it, just like I used to, they're doing it to pump up their own ego. They're not actually doing it out of kindness. Do you have any thoughts about this? When people come to us and they're like, oh, I'm just so busy, if you pay attention to your body, you can feel yourself resisting it. We at a very visceral level know that there's something icky about that. Like, I'm not interested in your busyness. The people that I find myself interested in are the ones who actually don't have a super full calendar, and they're not running around. They're not 20 minutes late to everything because they're so like, there's just this calmness and this prioritization of what matters. And I have a deep belief that, and again, it's all right to serve on boards. It's all right to tutor people. It's all right to do those things. Make sure you're prioritizing and not running around and doing it to inflate your own ego, because I actually think that's part of the problem. And at a visceral level, especially in like a two-party system like ours in the United States, what ends up happening is one side thinks that they're doing all the hard work and they're saving the world, and then they're mad at the other side because they're not doing what they think they need to do. And then it's just this tennis match back and forth. Is anything I'm saying making sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Do you have any thoughts?
I don't.
So I encourage you, if you feel so inclined, you don't have to do anything ever. But for me, it might slip out once in a while, but I'm really intentional. I don't say I'm so busy anymore. The word busy is actually, I repel against that word. I don't like that word. I don't use it for the most part, unless I'm like actually being intentional. And if I realize I'm really busy, I try to back out of it, because I'm not my best self. I'm not actually instilling the change. That's Sabbath. Anything else to close on?
I would just say that for me personally, I don't get too personal, as you know, but for me, Sabbath is not a day, it's a way of life. And for someone who has workaholic tendencies, I have tried to embrace in my own life implementing Sabbath by, when I'm tired, I take a rest.
Just noticing.
I take a break. I'm not much of a napper, but if I take a little 20-minute nap, not even by sleeping, just sitting and watching Cinderella with mm-hmm. Tabitha and Sophia, mm-hmm. I'm not sorry.
Yeah.
I'm not sorry. And so I used to always feel sorry and guilty for taking these little 15, 20-minute breaks here or there, because I have to be working all the time. So yeah. For me, Sabbath is something.
To always lean into.
For me, it's not necessarily a day, but it's a time of holiness and a time of rest that is a part of my everyday.
Yeah.
And I try to live into that. Because I know that that's what God wants, not only for me, but for all of us. And so that's all I really have to say about it. It's a way of being in the world.
It's not a day, and yet it is a day.
Well, sure. I will say that I'm not taking away the day.
Yeah.
No, I'm not.
Dillon and I do once a week, with few exceptions, have a day where it's like, okay, today. We even we label it Sabbath. We turn off our phones the night before. Or sometimes just like the afternoon, like noon until we go to bed.
I mean, every single month I'm required by the congregation that I serve, I'm required to offer a pastor's report, telling the congregation, well, really the church council, everything that I have done for that month. And on Saturdays, on my report every week, Saturdays are my Sabbath day.
Yes. Yeah.
But my Sabbath day does not mean just like Jesus healed people on the Sabbath day, I'm going to bury somebody on the Sabbath day. So yes, I take my Sabbath day, I keep it holy, and I rest, and I try to do things. I also keep it as a way of life, and yet at the same time, specifically if someone dies, I'm not going to be with that grieving family and bury the dead.
Yeah.
So, there you have it.
Yeah. And the last thing, 2 more things really quickly, is don't slip into this belief that the Sabbath is like, well, I rest now because then I'll have more energy later to do a lot more. No, the Sabbath is not for more productivity later. The Sabbath is rest for the sake of rest because we are free people. We are liberated. If you are listening to this podcast, that means that you are not enslaved somewhere. Unfortunately, there are people who are. And the Sabbath for them is a whole different conversation, but those are not the people that we are talking to. We're talking to you. And you are listening to this podcast because you get to experience some level of liberation. And I know some people are like, I have to work 7 days a week. Yes, of course, we see you. Me too sometimes, right? I have also had stages in my life, and I might face those stages again where that's me too. But right now, most of us can find a day or half a day where we experience the Sabbath for the sake of rest because we are not machines. We are not enslaved. And it is okay to acknowledge that there are people on this earth right now who are suffering and they are enslaved. And we get to help them and acknowledge that and do what we can from a place not that feeds our ego, but from a place of true, if you listen to our kenosis episode, emptying of ourself and filling up of the divine spirit so that God can work through us and we can help them in the ways we are suited to do. But we are only one person, and observing the Sabbath is about reminding ourselves that when we kind of exit the world for a day by not working, by not making money, by not participating in commerce, by connecting with our loved ones, actually life goes on and we can't save everything. So the very last thing I want to say is I already recommended the book Rest is Resistance by Tricia Heresy. Also, there is Romance Behind
Judaica.
Is that just another way to say Judea? Because I read this book.
No, not Judea, but the Jewish tradition. Judaica.
Is that how you say it?
Judaica.
I have never heard that. Okay, so Romance Behind Judaica, celebrating the richness of the Jewish calendar, which is written by Phaedra L. Shapiro. It's a very good one. Very good. If you're interested in like Jewish time and how they celebrate just their calendar.
And so is this one coming up.
The best book you can read for yourself. It is short. I am not kidding you. I honestly, this is not an exaggeration. I think I've read this book 20 times. It's in the top 5 list for me. It's so good. If you're interested in the Sabbath, it's written by a Jewish rabbi. However, it's not just for Jews. Anybody. I mean, it's if you're not a Christian, it doesn't matter. Read this book. It's so good. It's called The Sabbath by Abraham Joshua Heschel. Read it. I've never met anybody who has read this book. It's wildly popular who didn't love it.
I would say that everyone should read everything that Abraham Joshua Heschel has written.
Yeah. He's not alive anymore.
Oh no, he
died in the 70s.
He died.
Beautiful, accessible. Look at all these highlights I have.
It's interesting. This might sound very corny, but Abraham Joshua Heschel died in the 70s. I think he died in 1976.
72.
72. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But his life's work lives on in the lives. I mean, people are still doing Abraham Joshua Heschel's work.
Yeah, he was a talent,
and he's been dead for years now. So
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so there's some books. There's the Sabbath. I actually could go on and on and on about the Sabbath, but this is our longest episode yet, so we're gonna cut it.
It is indeed.
Cut
but
here.
It was fun, and hopefully you listened to all 1 hour and 37 minutes of it.
All right. Have a good week.
Have a good week.